All right. Welcome back, everybody, to another Future Focused, where we are living at the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience. I'm looking forward to it. This is a little bit of a continuation of last week. So last week, I started delving into the impact of technology on reporting and analytics and how we can actually analyze behavior change. We're leveling that up this week. This one's going to be a much deeper dive, and we're going to go a lot further on what the possibilities are of technology when it comes to analytics and reporting. And so to navigate that conversation with me, I've got Steve Wasick, and he's the founder of infoSentience. And Steve, thanks so much for making the time. I'm looking forward to getting into this, just even based on the energy in the pre-roll.
Awesome. Well, Christopher, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, so for people who may not be as familiar, I've gotten to know you through this whole process. So I know a little bit more about you, your background, all this other stuff. What's a little bit of background on who Steve is and how you ended up where you are right now?
So I took a little bit of a weird path, I would say, to being a technical founder because
You know what? You're not alone in that. Actually,
Yeah.
a lot of guests, we end up being like, oh, yeah. Last week it was, I started in film school. I'm like, makes perfect. Nothing surprises me anymore.
I listened to that. I actually was trying to be a screenwriter. And at one point, I did have an agent. I had my peak of my Hollywood career was I met with my agent, and then I got in the elevator and Leonardo DiCaprio was in it. And I was like 22 at the time. I was like, this is it. I'm on my way.
You made it. You've arrived.
I made it. That was it. That was the peak. I got my English degree, and I was actually in law school. I was going to school at Northwestern. I was in my third year of law school, and I had this idea it was just a sort of eureka moment. I don't know how else to explain it. I was just sort of sitting
Hang on, though, because you were Hollywood, Leonardo DiCaprio. Then you said law school.
Correct.
So something transitioned even before this.
Oh yeah, but I'm old, man. If I go through the whole,
okay, now you don't have to go through but so obviously there were some transitions that then led to law school.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot in between. So like, I think, let's just say I was in law school. I was sitting in bed, and I had this idea, a pretty sort of narrow idea, I would say, which was, I was in a fantasy football league, and I was really busy, and I didn't know what was going on with even my own team, let alone a lot of the other teams in the league. And I was like, oh, it'd be cool if there was a program that could just kind of give you a report about, hey, here's the interesting things that are happening, right? Because I follow sports a lot, but I don't even actually watch a lot of sports. I just like the narrative. I like the stats. And I think a lot of people are like that. And I was like, man, it'd be cool if there was something like that.
You like following what's going on, but you don't necessarily want to commit the time to watching every single game and trying to stay up on. And that's not necessarily even where you go, oh, I love doing that. It's more like, I just love knowing what's happening and keeping up to date on sports.
Yeah, the narrative, right? Like who's up, who's down, like what's
the bigger picture. Honestly, the bigger picture of what's everything that's happening in that.
Exactly. And so, but within my own league that I'm playing, there wasn't anything like that, right? So it just felt sort of removed and distant. I mean, if people were sort of talking smack or something, that was fun, but there wasn't a story otherwise. And so I just had this idea of like, oh, it'd be cool to just do this one thing. And I became obsessed with it, and I just started working on it all the time. And as I worked through that problem of like, well, how do you actually do that? I quickly started to run into some really significant challenges of how do you get a computer to write something compelling on the basis of statistics. And as I started solving a lot of these challenges,
so that it doesn't just spit out a bunch of like raw stuff that you're like, well, this isn't telling me much of anything.
Right. Or the flip side is you just do like a Mad Lib where you just say, hey, I'm going to write these same 5 things every time.
And carbon copy, where basically every week you get the same thing, and you're like, well, all it's done is swap out names, numbers, stats, and kind of boring.
Exactly. And I'd love to talk in the future, once you get past the intro, about exactly why that breaks down, because I think it's pretty interesting. People haven't necessarily thought
for sure.
But as I started solving these challenges, I realized, hey, wait a second, this is actually
this is a thing.
Football. And so I started my company infoSentience, and very fortunately got CBS as a client sort of right out of the gate to do fantasy football reports. And we're still doing that. This was like 12 years ago. So we've been doing generative AI since way before it was cool. And we're still, like I said, we're still doing the fantasy stuff, but we've expanded a lot more. And then we also kind of took a weird turn, I would say, as a company, because about 2 years into our operation, I thought we had technology that was better than any of our competitors. But I had another crazy idea for a sort of much more conceptual, much more general AI basis to put our reporting on. And I thought it would take me like about 6 months, and it took me 8 years. And I didn't, it'd be bad enough if I knew that it was going to take 8 years, but I didn't. I always thought it was almost done for 8
You just
straight
thought like, it's just the next, it's right around the corner.
It's almost there. It's funny, I've heard, Elon Musk gets a lot of crap about the self-driving, where he's like, we're almost there. We're almost there. And it's like, I sympathize with it, because it does, when you're there, you do really feel like it's right there. And I analogize it to being on a tree branch, right? And you're kind of, you're trying to go to a certain spot, and you're going along the branch, and you're sort of moving along, and you can see how close you are. And you're like, great, I'm right there. Look at, you analogize from
It's
how
within,
much
it's
move.
within visual cue.
Right,
I can see it.
I've
I
moved
know what
this
it looks
amount,
like.
and I only need 10 more. I only need to go 10% farther in this direction. But then you're at the end of the branch. Like, you cannot go down the branch anymore. You're at the end. And the only way to get to where you need to go is you got to go all the way back, because you went down the wrong branch. So it's like, you got to go all the way back to the beginning of the tree and try a new branch. And I did that. I mean, I literally started over from scratch seven or eight different times, depending on how you count it. We're literally, starting up, putting it in Visual Studio. It's like, all right, brand new project, new solution, nothing in there.
So it's not something, and I guess the kind of analogy, and it makes sense why some of these things, where I get it from the outside, you can be like, well, what the heck? Like, if you were so close, why didn't you just, but it's not something where you can just add more to the branch. It's like, no, there's no, we hit a point where there's no more branch to go. We actually have to climb back and find a different path, because it won't work.
Yep, exactly. It just the foundation is wrong, is what you realize. And so you have to and you can obviously take what you have learned.
Sure, there's learnings, and you're probably quicker to go back out a different branch. It's not, you're repeating the whole thing, but you can't just add this little nub on the end and then go out. It's like, well, no, the whole thing will fall apart.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was sort of a weird thing for our company. But the good news is, about 2 years ago, we got to where we needed to be. And our technology is now sort of doing all the things that we wanted it to do and more. And we've been very fortunate to get some great clients that are doing a lot of public facing things, which we can talk about as well, about some of the places where you might have seen us or will see us in the near future. So it's been an exciting sort of journey. And obviously we're in a great spot right now, in the sense that the world has sort of come.
You came at like a very convenient intersection of things.
Exactly. It's almost like, you that old outfit that you kept that was out of style for a long time. It's like, it's just been in the closet
and it came back in style. Like, you can pull the cargo shorts out of the closet and go, hey, they're in now.
Exactly. So that's us.
I love it. And, so let's talk a little bit about that, because for those of you who are listening to this, backstage, we were sharing different perspectives on what 2024 is going to be like, and how, on one side, I'm looking at this going, 2024 is going to be a crazy year. And you were like, I think we're kind of hitting some stability. And I'm looking at it going, I think a lot of companies are starting to go, all right, this whole AI thing was new to me, and now it's not new to me, and now I need to do something with it. So let's talk a little bit about, obviously you painted the picture of, hey, you were trying to understand the narrative better of fantasy sports, which I'm not a sports guy, but I know enough about it to be like, there's a lot you have to keep tabs on. And that's very relevant to organizations, not just fantasy sports leagues. There's a whole lot going on in the industry, in your company, all these other things that you're trying to understand. And that's not easy. So talk to me a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, I think I did bury the lead about, hey, what is exactly is it that we do?
Yeah, what is it you
Yeah,
do?
so basically we have technology that can analyze the data set, figure out what's important, and then talk about it like a good either journalist or analyst
Okay.
would talk about that information. So automated reporting using large data sets, and just like you said, with fantasy sports,
So
you got a
you
lot.
did, hang on though, but
Oh, yeah.
you did, from you doing this, you did bring some of that journalistic kind of creative that comes through in this, because to the earlier point, you could just spit out a bunch of numbers, but
Yes.
you recognize now that's not the secret sauce.
No, and when we originally pitched the fantasy idea, what we said was we want to give people a front page experience, not a back page experience. I'm obviously dating
Okay.
myself from newspapers where you have the box score right on the back page, and that's not where people turn to, right? They don't pick up the page
No,
like, let me go to the box
they
scores and
pick the front page and they go, yeah, they're reading the
they want to
headline.
see a headline, they want to see a picture, right? And that's what we do with our fantasy stuff. We have headlines and pictures and subheadlines and highlights and all these other things where we're trying to talk about the most compelling things that happened,
Okay.
right? And that gives people the context. And that same exact process happens within a business data, right? Like if you're looking at sales data
For
or
sure.
financial data, there's tens, however, depending on the size of your data set, there might be tens of
Oh,
thousands of numbers and tens of thousands of stories, right? That you could talk about, but you want to know what are the most compelling things, right? And you
yeah.
can either have somebody do that, which takes a lot of time, or you can have a computer do that for you. And there are situations where, for fantasy, as an example, where you have millions of these things where there's not even an option to have a human being do it.
No, I think what you're getting at, and that to me is one of the areas why I get so excited about the possibilities of technology with this is in some situations, there is literally too much information for any human to process. It's just, they'd spend lifetimes doing it, or the speed at which you need it. A human couldn't do it fast enough. By the time you got the information, you'd be like, well, this is irrelevant because this is already old news.
Yeah, that's a great point. And our ability to gather data has far outpaced our ability to analyze it and synthesize it.
Yes.
So that's
Yeah,
where,
we create and have far more data than we know what to do with.
yeah, and it's very typical for companies to be gathering tons of data that they can't use,
Oh, I
and
see it all the time.
all
I
the time,
see it all the time.
all the time. So that's where ideally our company comes into play. Is that basically anything that you could teach a human analyst to do with numbers, our
Yeah.
system can also do.
Okay. So on that one, well, let's see, where do I want to go with this? So let's talk about that in particular from a technology standpoint, and in some ways, how the technology is pulling that off. I
Mhm.
do think it's helpful because I know a fair amount of the folks. If you're listening to this, you're at least familiar with technology, because nobody listens to my stuff that's like, I don't know anything about technology. But you do have a unique way of doing that, because it is more than just, hey, we take a bunch of Excel data or Axe databases, and then we just run it through a filter and then pop out what we've meta tagged as the most relevant stuff.
Yes, and one of the key things that I should note at the very beginning here, talking about the technology, is that we are not an LLM, which
Okay.
obviously are all the rage right now. And when you say generative AI,
Oh
people
yeah.
just instantly think, okay, ChatGPT or something like
Yep.
that. And that is not the path that we went down, which I think is beneficial for us, at least in the moment, because a lot of these LLMs, they don't work really well with large data sets, right? So they
They
have
also
trouble.
don't work well with accuracy always.
Yes.
That's also something that can be very dangerous with LLMs, is if you go, it's one of the resistances that I see companies to going, hey, throw an LLM on top of all of your stuff and then employees can just ask and get the answer. And it's like, no, because it may not pull the right thing, or the way it may not be terribly accurate, which if you're looking for the headlines to make decisions and things like that, that can be a risky game to play.
It's very risky, and beyond that, if it does mess up, there's really no way to sort of debug it, right? You can't just say, "Oh, don't
Yeah.
do that again," right? Or if you say, "We don't want this particular type of information, can we just subtly change it?" Those things are really, really difficult to do because you're talking about systems that have in some cases, hundreds of billions of parameters. So there's not like one
Yep.
little dial that you can go in there and say, oh, just make this 20% more. They're really hopelessly complex to understand from the outside. So our system avoids that because we use what we call conceptual automata, which is a system where we create classes within or sort of small models within our system that are inbuilt, right? But that have intelligence to be able to sort of talk with each other and then self-assemble into a narrative. And I'll give you just an example of a small piece of what that would look like. So you and I, we have a concept of a team, right? That's in our head.
Yep.
So we can put that into our system and say, okay, here's a concept of a team and give it some characteristics. Each of those characteristics are their own conceptual automata that are, have their own connections, right?
But we can align on what those things are so that
Absolutely.
we're creating some of these parameters and some consistency around that.
And you can
that
see
is
exactly
agreed upon. Right? Is agreed upon.
Yeah, and you can say that's where the team is in this system. And then you can also have events or calculations, things like, hey, what is a streak? Okay, well, a streak is a series of the same event that happens over time, right? And we can say, well, one of those events could be a team winning a game, and we can map out what does that mean? It means that they score more points than the other team. So then you can put all that together and say, okay, well, a team is on a winning streak, right? And in our system, instead of that being like one function that says like, okay, because you can imagine, being a programmer and saying, okay, let me write up a function that says, okay, let's grab this team and let's look at their past games and whatever else. In our system, it's not like that. It's all these concepts, individual concepts
being reassembled.
They're together. And the key thing about that is then as you get more and more complex with a narrative, right, you can keep all that intelligence together as it builds. So for instance, if you say, okay, this team's on a winning streak and this other team's on a losing streak, now you can just join those two together, right? But every other thing in the system knows all of its subcomponents. So for instance, if you are talking about, that same team, again, in the next sentence, it can reference like, hey, have I mentioned this team before? Right? Maybe I don't mention their full name. Instead of saying like the Los Angeles Chargers, maybe I just say the Chargers, right? That's a small example, but there's all sorts of things like that where you have to worry about repetition, with what's gone before, like what naturally can build off of this sentence, right? All these little things that are.
There's rules and logic behind all that so that it's intelligent. Because I'm even just thinking, again, for people who are listening who go, how is this different than a large language model? If you asked ChatGPT what teams are on a winning streak, what you might get back would be, you just have no idea because you don't know how it's defining, and it's just looking for patterns of words to be able to go, well, what's a streak? What's a team? Like it's defining it through whatever criteria that you really don't know. And if you don't like what you get, to your point, you can't just go, show me. It's not easy at all to then try and tweak the dials to go, okay, now that's giving me at least not consistently. Like you might get, okay, this result got it for me, but you try and replicate that. It's not easy.
Yeah. And in our system, there's still a lot of complexity because once you start building this thing up, again, we have this idea of a team, but then it has characteristics. So it's connected. So it's getting all this different intelligence, every single interaction. There's a lot of crosstalk going on between these concepts. But at the end of the day, we can look at the pathways that they use to create something. So if we have something that appears in our narrative or our reporting that you're like, I don't want that to appear for all sorts of reasons. Either it's incorrect or it's not being written correctly, or it is happening, but it's not that interesting, or it doesn't make sense in this context, given what you're talking about. There's so many different ways that something could be not ideal in a narrative or a report. We can always look at the pathways to say, okay, why was this selected? At the end of the day, we can point to, okay, here were the factors that went into it. And then we can change any of those factors because at the end of the day, everything in our system comes down to these concept objects that we create manually, right? And to be clear, because there's a lot of things that are shared across analytic reporting, such as just being on a streak or something being an outlier event, things like that. It's like we can model those once and then use that for every
Yes.
application. So we don't have to start over from scratch with every new.
Kind of like the tree analogy you were describing, where it's like, well, you don't actually have to then go all the way back to the beginning. You actually can't say, well, we've already built this
So,
framework out.
yes.
We can copy and paste this or replicate it in a different way.
Absolutely. So a lot of our new projects, we start 80% of the way there, and it's really just about what are the unique aspects of your data
Yep.
that we need to add to the base system.
Well, and what's interesting about you describing this is it's probably been a couple months now since I had this conversation, but Kevin Saras and I had a conversation about large language models and some of the challenges with this. And one of the biggest challenges is it's the opposite of what you used to have to do with logic and things, in that you used to give it a bunch of parameters and it would only do what the parameters were that you gave it. With generative AI, all of a sudden it was like it's everything, and you have to try and tell it everything you don't want it to do. And it's a black box in terms of, well, I don't know what criteria or parameters it's even using. And so you've actually, in many ways, solved that by saying, well, let's find that right balance of let's create the right kind of parameters, but still have the openness of artificial intelligence, but in a controlled way that then gives you a consistent analytical approach, which is a very good thing for analytics and reporting.
Yeah, and I would say the fact that our system is not as generalizable is why we're not worth $1 trillion. But from a client standpoint, they just want it to work for them. So just to your point, the fact that it's much more specific and takes a little bit of time to customize, right? That's sort of our issue. And from a client standpoint, they just want it to work. They don't care that this thing also works for 50,000 other use cases.
But I think the thing with that, and I think this is where we're going to see artificial intelligence continue to move. And I think you're ahead of the curve, to your point of, in many ways, you're ahead of the curve in this. I completely agree, because that general use case, while wildly popular, ends up in some ways being so generalized that it's also very difficult to get it to do a specific thing that you're trying to get it to do. Like, I really need it to do this, which sometimes that's fine, because it's like, well, the implications of it aren't really that big of a deal. Like, I don't really care on that. But when I think about how companies and anybody should be using analytics and reporting, that's not something you just want to like back of the napkin swag, like, I don't know, like, is it, relatively generically close? Because I've been in plenty of meetings where people are arguing about the accuracy of, hey, we're about to make a multi-million-dollar decision on this. Is this the right information to be making that decision? And you don't want to go, I don't know. I mean, it's probably close enough.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's why a lot of these LLMs aren't used in wide-ranging, detailed, data-based questions, right? And there's also just really complicated logical questions that you have to put into the system that I don't think that these LLMs are able to handle, where it's kind of like, all right, there's this number, but you have to take it into context with this other number, and you have to weight it because it's only actually 5% of our sales, and all these different things like that where you're adding more and more complexity to the logical operation and needing it to have the system then balance that with 50 other stories that are just like that have a whole bunch of other different weights, and then try to figure out, well, which one of these things is quote unquote the most important.
So I have to ask, because based on your background in all of this, what you've created is more than just like somebody who went out and created a GPT on OpenAI and was like, hey, I have like an idea of how to, this is a very complex.
Yes.
Did you have a technical background, or like, where did that come from that you went, I know what I'm trying to do, I see what's at the end of this branch, but now I got to try and build this? Because what you've described is far more complex than, I don't know everybody who's listening or who will watch this, but I understand the complexity behind this. And this is not something that you spin up over the weekend when you're like, oh yeah, I just kind of like created a thing.
Yeah, I did take programming in high school, and I just sort of stuck with it. Like I tried to start a company when I was like 19. That was so it was so bad that it's almost, I look at the other people, like the adults in my life, and I was like, guys, couldn't you have told me that this was beyond stupid? It's almost like if somebody, that phrase, not even wrong, where it's
Yeah.
like you ask somebody, hey, what's your business plan? And they just like said banana. It's like, that's as good as my, like, where it's just like, wait, hold on. No, but they meant it. They just said the banana, like they didn't even, it's just so bad. But anyhow, I kept up with programming. And then, with being in law school, a lot of the things that I'm doing have some analogous kind of pathways to some of the stuff you're doing in law school, where you're trying to take
Yeah.
logical sort of combinations of fact patterns and trying to figure out like how do these fit together. And like I said, I had a background in English, so all that sort of
Yeah.
came together. And there was no book about this. Not like I missed taking this class in
Well, no, what you described, you couldn't have
it's
signed up
all
for a, Udacity boot camp in how to do
no.
this type of a thing. You were building it from the ground up.
Yeah, it's just all about sort of logical operations and their interaction with language. So I had actually a sort of decent conceptual background with that, between
Okay.
being an English major and going to law school. And then
Okay.
I had at least basic tools from coding. I
Okay.
certainly was not. You look at some of the code that I did back then; it's pretty atrocious. But I had enough that I could get started, and so I
You could
just
have
kind
Chat
of
GPT fix it for you. Maybe
I
you
did,
can
yeah,
you can
yeah,
revive your childhood dream.
yeah. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I went about
Okay.
it, and yeah.
No, but that makes sense. And again, I always love listening to people's stories, because for me, I'm all about understanding skills and the impact on human behavior, and hearing how these journeys come together. Because again, I have to, like law school, I think about the logics and the operation. How do you interpret the law, and what do you do to going into making a decision about, well, this is what the law says, but what does that actually mean? And how do we do
Mhm.
that? So it makes sense that that combination of things would then come together and say, okay, here's how we're going to do this around reports. So something you said earlier, though, that I almost went down this path, and I'm like, I'm gonna unpack the technology first. But you talked about how essentially what you're doing is doing what an analyst would do. And I talk a lot about the fact that from an employee standpoint, there's a lot of fear going around the world right now around what does this mean for, because maybe if you're an analyst listening to this and you're going, wait a minute, this is doing my job for me. But I don't see it that way. But I am curious, like, how does this end up working when you work with an organization? Because I can see people going, wait, you're just basically getting an AI model to do my job for me.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely be worried in the medium term. I wouldn't be worried in the short term. We're certainly not going to replace analysts with our technology, and LLMs aren't going to replace analysts with their existing technology. And I would say that we're sort of approaching the analytical problem from two different directions when it
Yeah.
comes to LLMs and us. And what we can do is because we're custom and because we're building these models ourselves, we can be 100% accurate. We can balance all the factors that we put into the system perfectly, right? So, but
Yeah.
the problem is that the number of factors is limited, right?
Yeah.
So we could say, all right, we're going to balance, let's just say your sales in this particular category, but weight it by how much these sales make up your total sales, right? So if we're trying to find what's the most
Yeah.
interesting thing that happened, maybe this particular product was up 80%, but it's 1% of sales, right? So it's like, okay, how do we balance that out, right?
Yep.
But you could imagine something where within a company you always do a huge Memorial Day sale or something, right? And so that's another factor too, right? If we're going to say like, oh, this was a big increase and we want to showcase it, we have to think about, okay, well, this is our
Yeah, you
sales.
have to look at those other factors to go, yeah, there was a big increase, but we also ran our annual Black Friday sale. So, of course, we had a big increase. So, that's not front page headline news.
Exactly. And maybe actually we need to compare this year to last year over the same time period. Whereas normally we're just comparing this week to last week, right?
Yep.
And so now that's something that we can put into our system, right? We can put that into that. But at some point, we're not going to have all the factors, right? Whereas a human
Yeah.
analyst can do all the factors,
Does.
right? So, but then from an LLM standpoint, it kind of can do all these factors. It just can't necessarily do them well, right? So it can kind of,
Yep.
because it's generalizable, it can think through all these different things. Like if you asked an LLM, hey, is this a scenario where you'd want to analyze something differently, right? It could probably actually think through that, but it can't actually put that all together, into
Yes.
an actual report. So human beings can do both of those things right now, right? Where you have the ability to be sort of think in true concepts, right? Where it's like, this is a sale, this has this effect, it's this time period. We can have these sort of discrete things that we can mash together in a very predictable way to come up with the correct answer, like not
Yeah.
hallucinate, right?
Yep.
And also have the flexibility. So for right now, there's definitely a lot of things that we can do, but we don't have the ability to take into account every factor, right? We can only sort of model the
Yeah.
key factors, which is obviously very helpful. And in certain situations, can even be kind of the whole enchilada, right? Depending on how many
Yeah.
factors there are. But most human analysts, I think, are in situations where ahead of time you don't even know all the factors that are going to go into it. And so you have to have like the flexible human intelligence to be like, hey, something came up and it's actually, it's Debbie in accounting that's out sick, or something. And so this is why this is, all these different things that are
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
used as part of the data are things that human analysts can still provide value for. Now, eventually, if you have sort of the merging of the LLMs and kind of what we're doing, where you have LLMs that can think in these discrete concepts that are sort of manipulable, right? Where they can take a concept and just sort of look at it from a different angle or apply it to something in the same way that human beings have, then you have sort of general AI. But then, if you're an analyst, like who cares? Like everybody's out of work at that point. So I don't know if,
Well, and what's
other than
interesting
plumbers,
about it
right?
though, and
Right.
no, but I like talking about these things because to me, when I listen to a lot of this, I because I spend so much time studying human behavior and psychology, I know people's like initial reactions. And so as soon as you said it does what an analyst does, I immediately went, someone somewhere will hear that and go, this thing does what I can do. But as I listen to you describe it, it absolutely is changing the role of the analyst over time. It absolutely is. But in many ways, a lot of what you described is that, well, who's setting the parameters? Who has that knowledge to be able to go, this is it? And that again is not static. That's the other thing people don't take, at least not for good analysts. Good analysts are adapting and learning, hey, what's the ecosystem of the organization? What environmental factors are happening that we need to account for? Things like this, so that you're constantly tweaking and manipulating and going, you know what, we need to change this kind of a thing. But you're actually interacting with that and then having that human oversight of, well, only the Debbie in accounting had this change that affected this type of, that's such contextual information.
Yeah.
And AI, it's terrible at context.
Yeah.
It's awful at context. It does not have that. And so I see how it absolutely, if you're an analyst and all your job is to go run the report, get the information, plug it into a thing, it is going to disrupt that in a
Yes.
sense over time. But do you become less relevant? No, I think if anything, the value you bring actually becomes more relevant, but you need to be focusing on those other areas. If you're trying to master your skill of creating the most intriguing headlines out of the data, you might want to rethink where you're investing your time and energy.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we've done with our technology, because we have it think conceptually, it allows it to sort of dive into any aspect of the data. And we have I think I
Yeah.
showed you the interactive demo that we have where you can have a report and it could have a sentence that's interesting. We think, oh gosh, like this number moved a lot. Like it might just mention that as a piece of context for the larger point, but you might say as an analyst, hey, I want more information on that. Well, with our system, you can actually literally double click on a sentence and get a brand new report just on that topic. And so
Yeah.
I think a lot of what we can do is help an analyst essentially navigate through the numbers. They can get the top line information. And then if anything else is interesting, they can dive into that and get a report. But then we can literally, drag and drop a sentence into a chart or into a table to get the raw numbers behind it. so that we can say, all right, I now actually want to see this for myself. But it's a way of sort of choosing your own adventure with analytics
Yeah.
that allows you to very quickly both get the top line, sort of here's the key information that you need to know from the computer, but then also be able to, keep going into that. And then when you're actually making the report to the higher ups, be able to add those human touches, right? Where the things that only or even saying, okay, I'm going to pull this paragraph out of this report and this paragraph out of this other report and assemble it myself because I know that these are the
Well,
actual.
and I was just gonna, that was the second half that you led right into it, which is also the fact earlier we said any organization today, literally, it doesn't matter how small you are. Like my dad and mom and my brother and my sister have a tiny funeral home, small chain of funeral homes up in northern Minnesota. They create more data than they know what to do with.
Yep.
So any organization, you don't have enough analysts to even look at what you have and make sense of it. And again, like you said, the ability for an analyst, instead of trying to make sense or find or seek all this stuff out, the ability to go, hey, I don't need to spend my time doing that, because most of the ones I know, that's not where they love spending their time anyway. They'd rather be contextualizing and making sense of this.
Yeah.
But then to your second point there, people, and I deal with this on corporations all the time, where those senior leaders, they still want that human interpersonal relationship of the person that understands what matters to you and the kinds of things that really help you make decisions and all this context that, again, they don't want to go to a dashboard and have to figure all this stuff out themselves. They want that level of personal service of that person who knows me, knows what I'm trying to figure out, and can get that information. And again, the interpersonal skills, I think that is a big shift. The interpersonal skills of an analyst absolutely would need to grow as a result of this, because that's going to be where you're spending more of your time going, I know that Steve really likes this information. This headline is really, I know he's going to want to know about this. So let me get those details so that I can make sure I'm prepared to be able to articulate, hey, here's the context. Yes, I know this jumps out at you, but keep in mind, this is due to this factor. And we actually don't want to spend a whole lot of attention and get distracted, because you may end up throwing a bunch of time and money on something I actually don't think that's going to be the best path you take.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's still a tremendous amount of higher level generalized thinking that analysts who are working with our technology still need to provide.
Right. If you're what we're talking about is, if you're a great analyst that is doing that kind of analytical interpersonal work, then yeah, there's absolutely, in my mind, places for all these people. So that's where the narrative of like AI is coming for our jobs, I was like, it may be coming for your jobs as they are today. Yes. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in 2024, where people go, well, I used to do this, now I don't have to. And you're like, well, yeah. And if you're going to sit, if you're a finance professional still insisting on doing long division math on your thing, you're probably going to struggle to find a company that goes, that's the person we need to have as our CFO type of a thing.
Yeah. And you could just look at some of the products that we've done in the journalism space, particularly if you look at CBS, I mentioned we did fantasy reports, but we've since expanded to covering all sorts of actual sporting events, like, the NBA, NFL, college basketball. I mean, we produce tens and tens of thousands of articles that go onto the CBS site that people do not realize are written by a computer. They read just like they're written by a human being. But the thing is that it certainly didn't put anybody out of work, because there was a lot of articles, things like, all right, if you're writing a preview of the Super Bowl, they got a writer to do that, fine. But if you're writing about the preview of some, random
Little League championship.
Yeah, somebody, it's just like, all right, this is like a Tuesday against Washington State is playing some D2 school. Like, they don't have a writer who's talking about what's going on with this game. And so that's what we did, was sort of fill in all the games where it's like, gosh, we'd love to have coverage of this, but we don't have somebody to do it. And some or there have been articles that would have been written up by a person, but it wasn't like the articles that they were really excited about writing. It's like, oh, hey, you're on, this beat right now where you got to write the preview for this game and write they'd rather be writing about, something a lot more interesting. That's much more complicated, right? From a human standpoint, it's like, okay, this person's doing really well, but how do we take into account, like the strength of schedule, or what they're doing with their coach, or their personal, that they're in trade rumors or something else, all these other things that human journalists are going to be able to do that our system
Yep.
has no chance of doing. It's like, those are also the things that are more interesting, I think, for humans to write, rather than, the 800th preview of, this team versus this team. So in general, it's been articles that weren't even written before. And to the extent that it replaced
Yeah.
human writing, it's the journalists are like, thank you. Like, I can actually write about something.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you brought that point up, because I continue to encourage people not to just think about artificial intelligence as, oh, what are we doing today that we could have artificial intelligence doing? But instead going, what are the things that we wish we could do, or we see opportunity, but we just go realistically from a resource capacity, from a plan, we can't do it. I can't justify doing that kind of work because I don't have the time, the dollars, the capacity to do that kind of stuff. Instead of just thinking about, okay, what are we doing today? So now how do we automate or optimize this? And the companies and the people I talk to who lean into that actually are some of the ones who are leading the charge, because they're starting to see, well, we can actually grow in different ways than we ever could have before. And we're actually able to differentiate in ways we couldn't before, because we started thinking outside the box of, well, here's where we are right now. So how do we just keep iterating on the same things?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I certainly encourage anybody who's listening, who is part of an organization that has a lot of data, to think about, hey, if we had 1,000 analysts that were just working for free, what could we do? Or 1,000 writers or journalists,
Yeah,
what are the things that we could do? Because I will say that's a challenge for us as a company, is that we don't necessarily know those things either, especially from looking outside of a company, right? It's like, we don't know
right.
what type of data you have. We don't know what's going to move the needle in terms of the types of communications that you would make with your clients or your potential customers or your stakeholders or whatever that is. We don't necessarily know what those things are from the outside. So it's a little bit of a challenge for us, where if the people inside aren't thinking about it because they don't know about the technology, and then we can't
Exactly.
necessarily think about it because we don't know all of the needs and the data that you have, right? So that's one of
Yeah.
the big disconnects that we have, and one of the challenges that we face in getting new clients, right? Is that there's
Yeah.
people aren't thinking about the possibilities, and
No.
from our standpoint, we can't really necessarily
You
say, like,
can't
hey,
come to them and go,
you're going
hey,
to,
we
yeah,
know where you could lean into that you're not doing
exactly.
today, because like, well, you have the intellectual capital to know where those opportunities lie. But I want to double like hit on this point, because it is so critical and there is so much opportunity. And I know from an employee standpoint, there are lots of people who have really great ideas, to that question of, if we had all the capacity, what would we do? They have great ideas, but a lot of times people are like, well, I don't want to bring this up because I don't have time or capacity to do this, or I don't have the resources. So it ends up staying quiet, versus you start socializing that and going, hey, what if we dove into this? And what is the way we get there? Well, let's use artificial intelligence. Let's use the latest in tech to help us create that capacity, so we don't have to go make a business case for $1.2 million in headcount and
Mhm.
overhead and technology. We don't have to do that. We can just go, that's a great idea. And you don't have that same fear of failure of, well, let's try it. If it ends up not doing anything, we turn it off. We don't
Right.
have to fire anybody. We don't have to
Right.
lay anybody off. We don't got to cut that part of the organization out. We just say, lesson learned, change our path.
Exactly. And I will say, once we start the process, the burden on our clients is very, very low. Typically, it's just, hey, we need to have access to data, which is usually pretty easy because we just use the same methods that they use internally. And we need to have some examples, right? So just write up what you want to have. And then we look at the data, we say, yeah, we can get from A to B. And that's basically all you need to do as a client of
Yeah.
ours. And I will say too, speaking of getting turned off, which obviously we don't want to have happen from our standpoint, but I will say that every single product that we've ever launched, I mean, we've been in business for 12 years. None of them have been turned off. Like, every single one of the products that we have launched, we are still doing today. Every single client that we've worked with, we're still working with today. So
Yeah.
it's been a good, we've had a good success rate in terms of when we roll something out and people have a chance to use it, they like it. So that's
Yeah.
another, to
Well,
that,
and
not only do you not have to fire somebody, you probably hopefully won't even.
I want there's something else I want to ask you about, but what I was going to say is from a turn off standpoint, where I was thinking about it is, let's say you said, "Hey, we want to start running reports on this thing to see if it adds value," and you realize it's not really getting us what we thought. So you pivot and you didn't hire a bunch of analysts to research a bunch of data that you then go, oh, well, now what are we going to have these people doing? You go, you know what? Let's redirect those resources. It's much easier from a flexibility standpoint. Because again, based on what you said, I can't see a world where you'd go, the ability to turn these things on and off, spin these things up, get this kind of information. I don't really think that's important, but I can see it creating more of an environment of experimentation on, well, let's explore the depths of something maybe we hadn't before. And if it turns out there wasn't anything down that rabbit hole, okay, we learn from it, we move on, we look somewhere else.
Yeah, and going back to the point I was making earlier about when we model something, a lot of times we have a start, right? So we start, 80% along the way, and then it's just the unique aspects of your particular data. Well, that
Yeah.
same thing holds even more if we've done something for you as a client. And so even if the report that we create isn't necessarily what you need, at that point we kind of have access to the data. We have a lot of the intelligence that your company is using modeled into our system. And so the cost to then say, oh, let's try actually, instead of sending this out to our internal team, like what if we could make a more generalized version that we could send out to our clients like on a weekly basis so that they get like a weekly newsletter of what's going on with their data or how things are progressing. That usually is a lot easier. And this has happened with CBS where, all right, we did football first and that took a lot of work. But then when they said, all right, let's cover basketball, it's not like we're starting over from scratch, right? This is a much smaller lift. And so each progressive sport that we've added has been for less and less money. And so that is another benefit to sort of starting the process of working with us and having us model this stuff, is that once it's there, everything else can often is like much easier, right? And a lot of times even just delivery stuff where it's like, okay, we're sending out an email, but now can we do this as a website, right?
Can we
individual
Can we step it up? Can we add another component? Can we make it? Yeah. And again, that's where I just continue seeing so much opportunity to think bigger. And I think that's an area that people just have historically struggled to do because bigger just always feels unattainable or it feels like too much, versus now it's becoming so much more attainable, in my opinion. And that's what to me is so exciting about technologies, about like what you're doing, which by the way, I'm a big fan. So since you're a sports person and into the whole journalist thing, and we talked about, how you have some of these things, writing articles on some of these sports things, I have to imagine you saw the whole Sports Illustrated debacle. Are you familiar with that whole thing?
Well, I thought that there was like two different ones. There was
the one people found out that they were presenting sports writers as real people that were AI, and then it ended up just causing a whole bunch of stuff.
Oh, was because I thought that it was like reviews or something. Maybe I'm getting it wrong.
No, they were publishing articles, but they were being said like, if this was written by so and so and representing that as a person, but it wasn't a person. And I read some of the articles that they took slack for, and I was like, yeah, that was bad. Like that was really bad what you put out. So I'm actually curious, because this does get back to that, like, where do you draw that line on that, of that? And to me, my issue as I looked at it was more with the misrepresentation of, you said it was John or Amy, the sports writer. You wrote a whole profile and created an AI generated headshot for this fake person. And my reaction was, I think that's more what people reacted to, less the like, okay, so some of these news articles, like, I get you didn't put a journalist on it type of a thing, but this was crap content and you represented it as though it was done by one of your top journalists.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. There's tons of articles that are pretty openly written by AI, including ours, including ones on stocks and everything else, nobody cares as long as it's pretty clear that that's what was happening. And yeah, exactly, like creating a fake headshot, profile picture and everything else. It's double. I mean, I think we actually could probably get away with that because I think our stuff is good enough that you couldn't tell it was written by a human being, or wasn't written by a human being. But if you're also going to make it bad, it's almost like you're misrepresenting it and you're insulting the person's intelligence. Where it's just like, yeah, this is obviously written by a computer. So, but yeah, I think as long as you're upfront about it, then I think that it's fine. I think that people, especially again, with something like, we're working with Max Preps, which is the largest high school sports company, high school sports site in the United States. Obviously, they're not going to write 100,000 articles every week, right? But people still like having coverage, especially if you're taking the time to produce something that's real quality, that's actually, surfacing some interesting context. Like, hey, this is the biggest victory they have over such and such team since, 2014, or whatever, or looking at, they're facing this other team, but they're not going to have, their star quarterback from last year who did this last time they played. These are all just like the basic things that you'd want to talk about if you were a human journalist trying to find the most interesting stories. And if you're surfacing those things, I think then you're providing real value in a way that if you're just doing a Mad Lib, where you're just kind of saying, hey, they won, they won this to this, their record is now X, they play this team next week. It's like, all right, I guess that's something. But it's like, especially if you're trying to play that off as being written by a human being, like people are going to get pretty upset with what you're doing.
No, and I think that's, as I watched the whole thing unfold, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not even a sports person, but I follow the tech industry and I'm an analyst on that end. And to me, the unfortunate part with it was people pointed the finger at artificial intelligence as kind of the initial reaction. And I leaned into that going, this was poor decision-making on behalf of people. Again, the misrepresentation of it, my overall, I've done a fair amount of surveys and had a number of conversations. To your point, most people are like, a lot of things, I don't care whether an actual human being wrote this thing or not, but don't lie to me about it. And also, like, be more I think the transparency thing is what really set people off. And to me, that was unfortunate because I went, yeah, this is going to be one of those things that then makes people go, yep, see, this is why you shouldn't do AI. And I'm like, no. There are things that you shouldn't do. Yes. But leveraging AI, and maybe they should have used your AI and they wouldn't have run into the same issue.
Well, that's definitely true. So
that's definitely true. We know that.
That's for sure.
But it's kind of a conclusion. Like, I am curious, as you look at what organizations are doing, we talked a little bit about some of the practical use cases backstage. We talked about, like, where do you see organizations going with this in terms of helping them? Obviously, yeah, if you're a sports publication, great. We've unpacked that one plenty. But if you're a business, if you're in manufacturing, if you're some of these other businesses doing this, you're in healthcare, where do you see companies starting to go, hey, you know what? This kind of technology could really help take us from where we are now to where we want to be?
Yeah, unfortunately, we run into the same problem that I mentioned before, where from the outside, we can't 100% know. So I think maybe the best thing to do is just talk a little bit about some of the use cases that we're doing right now. Yeah. We have a pretty broad range of different types of products that we're doing. We did mention the sports stuff. We have a product with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is rolling out here in the next couple months, where we basically take all of the commodity data and use that to generate reports. So it's sort of similar to what we do for CBS, where we have sports data, then we generate sports articles. It's like, hey, we're generating articles about the commodity market. One of the things that's a little bit different about that is that the commodity market's changing like every minute, right? So this is, our system is going to as well. So basically, at any moment, you can get articles about what is going on, right now in the corn market. Like, here it is. And 5 minutes from now, that article is going to be a different article because the numbers will change. So that's something that I think is pretty interesting. We work with a marketing company called Tenuity that does B2C marketing campaigns, right? Where they have all these pieces of information about different campaigns that they're trying. Like, what are the conversion rates? What are the costs? Like, what are the different channels that we're working on, right? Again, just a sea of data that's very, very hard to make sense of. And our system is able to create reports for their internal team, right? To be able to look at that. And so you can do reports that are public facing, that are just general, people can read, right? Which is what we do with CBS or the CME. You can do reports that are individualized to your clients or customers, which like our fantasy reports like that. But you can imagine other stuff where if you're a portfolio manager, let's say, and you're working at Charles Schwab and you have all these clients, obviously they send out reports at the end of the year, right? Here's what's going on with your data, but it's not really customized. The numbers are custom, but the narrative isn't custom, right? Like,
right. It's the Mad Lib. It's the Mad
Yeah.
Lib where it's like, here's the thing we send to every single customer, but all we did was swap
Right.
your numbers and, your name in, but basically you got a generic, which personalization to me is king in the people have an expectation of personalization.
The problem with a Mad Lib is that the way to do it, the way to set it up is to say, what are the things that are always going to happen that people care about, right? Which is cool. All right, that's fine. It gives you the basic stuff. But the things that are always going to happen are by definition not particularly interesting, right? Because they always happen, right? Like if you say, hey, going back to sports, hey, the team won and now here's their record and here's who they're playing the next week, right? Those are always going to happen, but they're not interesting, right? It didn't say like, hey, like this is the 5th straight week now that they've lost as an underdog or something. It's like, oh, that's interesting, right? And the same thing with your own personal financial information. Yeah, it's always going to go up. It's always going to go down, and but it's like, do you have the context of like, gosh, like it was this sector that was driving your particular portfolio or whatever it was where, this is we've actually done better versus our goals now for 3 straight years, or where you've outperformed the market for, this, whatever it is, where you're looking at what are the actual compelling things that you care about. You can't know that in advance, right? By definition, right? Like there's just too many things that could happen. And so, yeah, getting to this personalization, is so important. It's not just a sort of aesthetic thing or like, oh, this reads better. It's like the reason that you think it reads better if you're reading something that's well written is because it's actually telling you the information that you need to know, and you're being able to
in the
process
way that resonates with you.
Yeah, because it's structured well, so you can understand how everything relates to each other. All those things are super important. And again, it is hard for me to say it from the outside, kind of exactly what we could do. But again,
I'll help you out on this one. So
yeah, think about
but
as an analyst, what could you do? What could you send out internally, externally? Could you make it a website? Could you make it an email? Could you, do this for your own training data for LLMs potentially? That's something that we thought about doing in the future. There's just so much that you could do if you have the ability to create reports or content on a near limitless scale. And so that's what I would just encourage people to think about who are listening to this. What could you do if it was just free to create content or reporting?
Well, and like I said, I can give you a hand on this because I deal with this on so many levels, especially on the internal side.
Mm-hmm.
So from the external, what do you do to the market? I'm not on the PR media side of things, but internally, when I think about how many people, and I mean, there are whole departments set up, and not saying you do away with these departments, but I know these departments, as an example, people analytics in companies is a massive function that never has the time to get to what people really want because they are so strapped because they're trying to figure out what the heck is going on in the organization. The sales leader, the chief commercial officer wants to know why we had a bad quarter, and they're trying to understand all this. And so they're asking their people analytics team, can you run all the data on, and they're like, good. Like what data, what requirements do they literally every analytics department on the internal side, because this happens all the time. Just as a simple example, in HR, we're in performance review goal setting season. The number of analytics and reports that are happening in an organization trying to understand how did our company perform this year? How is that connected to the performance of our employees? How does that help us plan for what we need to do next year? Things like that. I'm legitimately excited about what this possibility is because I've seen the number of teams who have zero capacity. And I've seen the number of business leaders that are thriving for, I need this information to make better decisions, and not that. And it ends up, and I've been on the email chains where there's 300 back and forth. No. Can you get it with this? And poor Johnny or Jill, who's the one on the other end trying to sit and, oh gosh, I got to run this report again and then send it to you. And then they go, no, I don't want it for that. Can you run it for this division? Can you run it for this function, type of a thing? And you still can't even get to like, what are you actually getting at? This kind of power is significant. And I think especially as companies, I mean, we always have run on data, but never have we had it in a digital format where we could manipulate and do so much with it and actually make it actionable versus it's sitting on a, notepad or, file cabinet somewhere that Lord knows we're never going to be able to do anything with it. Now it's actually in a format. It's in a medium we can actually tangibly do things with, but most companies have no idea how to even handle what's in their labs.
I agree.
There you go. I don't know, we even work for you. And I'm legitimately that excited about what this could do for organizations. And to me, this is one of those very innovative ways that companies can think radically different about the way they're strategizing, the way they're planning, the way they're making decisions to make better decisions. And it makes for an overall better work culture, because instead of wringing your people dry and squeezing blood from a turnip, going back and forth on just this like rote, oh gosh, I got to pull this other report and now I got to do another one for this person in this division because it's the same report, but it's over here, but they don't like it this way because they want it this certain way. And it's thousands, millions of man hours and millions of dollars being spent on this that companies aren't realizing is just money just going straight out the door. So there you go. Anything you'd add to that?
No, I mean, I appreciate it, man. You're doing my work for me. So I would just say, again, to anybody who's listening, feel free to reach out. We can do a demo and just talk through, like I said, it's got to be collaborative because you're the one who knows what's going to actually move the needle. Right. It's hard. So, but well,
and kudos to you, and don't lose that. Honestly, don't lose that. I actually think the humility you bring to that of saying, we are a partner, but we're only as good as what you can give us. Like what you're going to get out of this is only as good as what you put into it. Your ability to think about the possibilities, your ability to think about these data points, the new possibilities you're not exploring, versus saying, hey, get this thing and it's magically going to change your business.
Right.
Well, it's not. Right. And I think people know that. And I think bringing that attitude, I think just don't lose that. Don't ever lose that. Cool.
I won't.
Well, thank you. Thank you again. Like I said, I knew I was going to get excited about this one. It's a Wednesday snowy afternoon. And I think I'm just as excited about the fact that snow's melting. So I'm not going to have to go shovel again as I am about the topic. But Steve, this has truly been a blast of a conversation. And again, for those watching and listening, regardless of what you're doing, there is so much more that you could be doing with your data. And I would encourage you to lean into the possibilities because it truly is transformational and the technology is there. So Steve, thanks so much for your time.
Christopher, thanks so much for having me.
All right. We'll talk to you later. And everybody else, we will see you next week.